The 6020 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
You graduated either the lowest or almost the lowest in your class. Don't ever use the word smart with me. Don't ever use that word.
Oh, give me a break.
Because you know what? There's nothing smart about you, Joe.
When President Donald Trump and Vice President Joe Biden took the stage for their first presidential debate in Cleveland, Ohio this year, they were following in the footsteps of presidential debates that came before them. The first debate between any two presidential candidates in the general election was held in a Chicago TV studio between Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy.
I agree with Senator Kennedy's appraisal generally in this respect.
I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same.
While the tone of Nixon and Kennedy's debate in 1960 was very different from this year, both were national events watched by more than 70 million Americans. As discussed in the last episode, both Nixon and Kennedy understood the importance television could play in the campaign. And Nixon, who utilized television so effectively throughout his career up to this point, was confident in his ability to challenge Kennedy on camera. Historian and former Nixon Presidential Library Director Tim Naftali says it was Nixon, not Kennedy, who saw himself as the first TV candidate.
Richard Nixon sees himself as very good on television, as opposed to President Eisenhower, who never quite got comfortable with the media.
And with a television in 9 out of 10 American homes, the opportunities and the risks in these debates were bigger than ever. As the campaign of 1960 entered its final stage with the first presidential debate set to begin, who would benefit most, Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy? We'll tell you how that debate changed the 1960 campaign and the many that followed, coming up on this episode of 6020.
While it is dangerous to see nothing wrong in America, it is just as wrong to refuse to recognize what is right about America.
Today our concern must be with that future. For the world is changing, the old era is ending, the old ways will not do. It is time, in short, for a new generation of leadership.
60 years ago, Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon would face off in one of the closest elections in the nation's history. The election would leave lasting impacts on future races right into today. In this episode, we'll look closely at the first Kennedy and Nixon debate, including the preparation, results, and its impact on the rest of the campaign. This is 6020. Many know 1960 as the first time presidential candidates would debate live on TV. However, 4 years before, surrogates for each candidate would debate live on CBS's Face the Nation. Notably, the two surrogates were both women, Senator Margaret Chase Smith for Eisenhower and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt for Adlai Stevenson.
That there can be no question in the people's minds of the failure of our policies in the Near East, which have now resulted in our making NATO weaker.
It was also the first time a woman would appear on the popular national political program. 4 years later, the candidates themselves faced off against each other for the first time on live TV. Both campaigns agreed to debate live on television 4 times in the fall. In a telegram to NBC, Kennedy thanked the broadcaster for providing a, quote, notable public service, end quote, by providing the opportunity to debate on television. Historian and author Frederick Logval says there wasn't much opposition because both candidates felt they could out-debate the other over the airwaves.
I think the debates came about because both campaigns thought that they had something to gain from them. I think we can say in hindsight that Kennedy in particular had something to gain from debating Nixon. There was, we have to remember, a pretty widespread view in the electorate that John F. Kennedy was too young. He looked even younger than his years, but more importantly, that he lacked the kind of experience that one would need from a chief executive.
Logval said by simply sharing the stage with the vice president, it immediately elevated Kennedy in front of a national audience.
He can demonstrate in these debates, that in fact he's got what it takes, that he can stand toe-to-toe with his opponent, be equally comfortable, equally authoritative, equally poised, maybe even more so. So he's got a lot to benefit from this. If I can be on screen next to Richard Nixon, that helps me.
Tim Naftali said Nixon had overestimated his experience on TV and underestimated the effect the debate would have on elevating his opponent.
Nixon looks at television as his friend. That's an important bit of background to understanding why the debates happen. In retrospect, it seems that Richard Nixon should not have put himself on a stage with John F. Kennedy, that the contrast between these men was so enormous that it could not possibly have benefited Richard Nixon, whatever he said or however he said it. But that's not how Richard Nixon viewed it.
Naftali also says Nixon was extremely confident of his debate skills.
He'd done well in high school. He'd been a debating champion in college. He was a lawyer. Richard Nixon just thought he would have the better of Kennedy.
After seeing Kennedy's convention speech, Nixon was confident he could beat him in a debate. And it wasn't just Nixon. Many in the Republican Party also underestimated Kennedy early on.
John F. Kennedy's reputation among many elites was of a lightweight. And so it made sense for Richard Nixon to think he would just cream John F. Kennedy in a debate. He's a better debater, more experienced. Kennedy's legislative record was not that impressive. And despite the fact that John F. Kennedy did read books, I think Richard Nixon thought of himself as much more thoughtful, more of a thinker.
On the other side, Kennedy was determined not to be outdone in the first debate. Kennedy had a number of close advisors, including speechwriters Ted Sorensen and Richard Goodwin, pollster Lou Harris, and one of the first television consultants, Bill Wilson, who worked for the Stevenson campaign in 1956.
He also gets coaching from people around him. Ted Sorensen, Bill Wilson, for example, who is a TV kind of guru. And one of the interesting things that they say to JFK is that he should not look at his opponent, but he should in fact look into the camera. Today we think, well, that's sort of an obvious thing, but it was not obvious then. And I think if you look at the first debate, it's a really interesting difference between the two candidates, because that's what Kennedy does. Nixon is much more inclined to direct his answers to Kennedy.
Kennedy flew into Chicago the weekend before the debate, and then took a day off to prepare, something that is now the norm in today's presidential campaigns.
He's basically locked down prior to the debate, and he's got an array of cue cards. And while he's propped up on his bed in Chicago, he's reading these cue cards, trying to memorize the information on those cue cards, then putting them aside and seeing how much he remembers. And he's got, by the way, a phenomenal recall. Even as a kid, teachers and classmates would comment on the fact that he has a really good memory, and it serves him well.
Unlike JFK, Nixon kept up a busy schedule and prepared for the debate on his own, refusing to meet with his media strategist until just before the debate. Naftali says Nixon was also tired and not in the best of shape leading up to the one-on-one matchup.
He had contracted a staph infection after hitting his knee very hard on an open door, car door, and he'd spent 2 weeks in the hospital. And after coming out of the hospital, he had started his campaign, and he had run too hard. He didn't give his body time to recover, and so he developed the flu. He wasn't looking very healthy. He wasn't feeling very good, and he was overconfident. So you have all these factors weighing against him.
In the weeks and months leading up to the debate, Naftali says Nixon underestimated Kennedy.
Kennedy went into this debate knowing that he was the underdog and knowing he had to prove himself. Richard Nixon went into this debate thinking that Kennedy would be a pushover. That's always dangerous. No matter how good you are at anything, it's never good to underestimate your adversary, and that's exactly what Richard Nixon did.
But Nixon also understood the stakes were high. As he wrote shortly after the campaign, Nixon said all the campaigning he had done would be a, quote, drop in the bucket, end quote, compared to the first debate. Coming up, we'll go to Chicago and take you to the first live televised debate between Senator Kennedy and Vice President Nixon.
Are you listening to our podcast and wondering if there's more to the story? Of course there is. If you want to learn more about what you've heard today, we have links to resources from the JFK Library's archives, including photos, films, and primary source documents. We also have oral history interviews from some of the key members of the Kennedy campaign. Visit jfklibrary.org/6020 to get started.
Unlike modern debates where candidates meet in front of live audiences on stages that are sometimes larger than life, the Kennedy and Nixon debates were relatively simple by comparison. Nixon and Kennedy's first debate would be in a CBS studio in Chicago. A 38-year-old Don Hewitt produced the debate. He would later go on to create 60 Minutes, television's longest-running news program. Hewitt offered both campaigns the opportunity to participate in a pre-production meeting for the live debate. The Kennedy team accepted the offer, but the Nixon campaign didn't. In fact, JFK personally flew into Chicago to review guidelines and ground rules. According to David Pietrusia, he asked detailed questions like, "Can he interrupt? Can I interrupt?" Frederick Logval said JFK entered the first debate more prepared than Nixon to handle the unique aspects of debating on television.
But this is a guy who in 1952, so 8 years before this, already had studied and had been told, this is the way you should try to look into a camera, and you should not look into a camera some other way. You should show, your head should tilt up a certain way. You should wear the following things, but avoid wearing the following things. In other words, I think long before this, JFK had a sense of what was necessary to come across well on television that I think Nixon was only dimly cognizant of.
Logval says Nixon famously had issues on how he presented on TV that night.
Nixon did not show well, if I can put it that way. He'd been in the hospital, so he was underweight. His shirt collar was too loose. There was a kind of nervous quality to his appearance, if I can put it that way.
Makeup would have helped the sitting vice president, but instead Nixon would only agree to applying what he described as beard stick powder to cover his 5 o'clock shadow. Unfortunately for Nixon, he later realized that the beard stick made him look pale. In his memoir, 6 Crises, Nixon recalls his own mother and his secretary's mother calling him after the debate to see if he was feeling all right. Kennedy also initially refused to wear makeup, but his TV consultant Bill Wilson was able to persuade him to put some on. From head to toe, JFK looked impressive. His dark suit contrasted with the studio background, unlike Nixon's gray jacket, which blended in. Logval says Kennedy was light years ahead of his competition on understanding the visual needs of television.
JFK practices how he's going to be on television. How should I appear? How should I dress? Where do I look? He's kind of a veteran at this, and I think it shows.
In his oral history at the JFK Library, Dan Rather, who was working at a television station in Houston at the time, said Nixon's poor presentation was noticeable. However, he didn't think that's what made the difference that night. However, he thought the issues over makeup, Nixon's beard line, and even his sweating were, quote, overemphasized. With the stage set and the candidates TV ready, the first debate was ready to begin. The candidates would each have more than 7 minutes to make their opening statements, an eternity compared to today's debate rules. Both candidates sought to deliver a clear message to the 70 million Americans watching from home, an audience so large for 1960 it would be comparable to today's Super Bowl viewers. As for the key messages of the 1960 debate, Kennedy focused on the idea of getting America moving again and describing the country as standing still under the Eisenhower-Nixon administration.
I should make it very clear that I do not think we're doing enough, that I am not satisfied as an American with the progress that we are making. This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country. And this is a powerful country, but I think it could be a more powerful country.
Kennedy called attention to the pockets of poverty in the nation, despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
I'm not satisfied when we have over $9 billion worth of food, some of it rotting, even though there is a hungry world, and even though 4 million Americans wait every month for a food package from the government, which averages 5 cents a day per individual. I saw cases in West Virginia, here in the United States, where children took home part of their school lunch in order to feed their families, because I don't think we're meeting our obligation towards these Americans.
He also called out how racism in the United States was holding back generations of black and brown Americans.
I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights. If a Negro baby is born, and this is true also of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in some of our cities, he has about 1/2 as much chance to get through high school as a white baby. He has 1/3 as much chance to get through college as a white student. He has about 1/3 as much chance to be a professional man, about 1/2 as much chance to own a house. He has about 4 times as much chance that he'll be out of work in his life as the white baby. I think we can do better.
Nixon would respond to Kennedy and try to counter his argument that America was standing still.
Looking then to this problem of how the United States should move ahead and where the United States is moving, I think it is well that we take the advice of a very famous campaigner. Let's look at the record. I think we find that America has been moving ahead. Let's take schools. We have built more schools in these last 7.5 years than we built in the previous 7.5, for that matter, in the previous 20 years. Let's take hydroelectric power. We have developed more hydroelectric power in these 7.5 years than was developed in any previous administration in history.
Nixon painted a far more rosy picture when it came to the economic standing of Americans.
This means that the average family income went up 15% in the Eisenhower years, as against 2% in the Truman years. Now, this is not standing still.
In the first debate and the 3 that followed, the candidates would touch on a range of domestic issues, including Social Security, jobs, education, and healthcare, along with foreign policy. But underneath all of their arguments, the 2 candidates tried to separate themselves as the most prepared to step into the job. Nixon had the initial advantage of already serving in the White House as vice president.
Through the years, I have sat in the National Security Council. I have been in the cabinet. I have met with the legislative leaders. I have met with the president when he made the great decisions with regard to Lebanon, Quemoy Matsu, other matters.
But Kennedy was confident in asserting his own experience.
The vice president and I came to the Congress together, 1946. We both served in the Labor Committee. I've been there now for 14 years, the same period of time that he has, so that our experience in government is comparable.
Most importantly, Kennedy framed the choice as one between the 2 parties.
I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
When asked by the moderator to respond to this,
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
Nixon said he had no comment. For an experienced, accomplished debater, Nixon's lack of a response to this key question appeared to be a missed opportunity. Dan Rather again describes how people felt watching the first debate from his local station in Houston.
John Kennedy definitely benefited from low expectations. He exceeded expectations. And Vice President Nixon did not live up to expectations.
Reviews of the first debate would line up with the opinions of Rather and his staff. Polling from both Gallup and the Sherwin research firm had JFK winning by large double-digit margins. According to JFK's pollster Lou Harris, the candidates were neck and neck before the debate, but with a 4-point swing in the Gallup poll, Kennedy pulled ahead of Nixon after it. Harris wrote that this was the first time that either candidate has been able to show the other open water. He said, quote, "This is almost wholly the result of the Monday night debate." Tim Naftali describes the first debate's impact.
The first debate was a pivotal moment, and it stopped Nixon's momentum and pushed Kennedy ahead. So Kennedy was in the driver's seat in the election after the first debate. It got close again. The game wasn't over, but Kennedy went ahead.
Even though Nixon improved in later debates, Frederick Logval points to how the first one may have made a lasting impression.
I don't think they anticipated that these debates would loom as large as they would, and especially the first one. It's to Nixon's misfortune that he did better in subsequent debates, but, that first impression in some respects stuck.
And he says the debates proved essential for Kennedy to introduce himself on one of the largest national stages available.
I think what the debates did for John F. Kennedy, I think they convinced a lot of people who might have been skeptical, people who might have been relatively apolitical. So they hadn't perhaps paid a lot of attention to the primaries, maybe didn't read the newspaper, the political coverage really closely. I think he satisfied undecided voters. Not all of them. I'm sure some of them drifted over to Nixon. But he satisfied a substantial number of undecided voters that, yeah, this guy is young. He's younger than most presidential candidates. And he looks even younger than he is. But he's got what it takes. I think the debates served that purpose for him, and I think it mattered.
In the following debates, Nixon was determined to improve his appearance. He started drinking rich milkshakes, which helped him put back some of the weight he had lost during his illness. He also took the advice of his staff and used actual makeup. And he had his team pay more attention to the lighting and his wardrobe.
He understood that he needed to up his game, that he had actually a pretty skillful opponent, somebody he had to take seriously. And that Jack Kennedy was no slouch when it came to repartee and to debating. And so I think Nixon hunkered down. I think he was more prepared. I think he was more energetic. I think he did look better.
Nixon sounded more confident in later debates.
All that I can say is this. What we need here are not just high hopes. What we need is action. And in the field of executive leadership, I can say that I believe it's essential that the President of the United States not only set the tone, but he also must lead. He must act as he talks.
Tim Naftali agrees that Nixon improved his performance.
He learned from his mistakes. He looked healthier. He and Kennedy and Senator Kennedy had some very substantive discussions about foreign policy. Kennedy made some mistakes. The last three debates were a lot closer. Nixon's performance wasn't shockingly bad. He didn't appear to be a deer caught in the headlights anymore.
Despite making a comeback, Naftali says the first impression really hurt Nixon. And he says the debate itself did something the vice president didn't expect.
The first debate put him on the same level as a sitting vice president. And that's a big gift.
There's one long-standing myth surrounding the first debate. The belief that TV audiences thought Kennedy won and radio listeners thought Nixon was the winner. Historians dispute this popular opinion as more myth than reality.
There is this data point that I hear all the time, which is that the people who listened to the first debate on the radio thought Kennedy had lost. And those that saw it on television thought Kennedy had won. I think it may have to do with some interviews that were done afterwards, but I'm not sure it was a scientific poll. Let me put it this way. It should not be conventional wisdom that the effect of this debate, the first debate, depended on whether you heard it on radio or watched it on TV.
The origin of this myth may have come from a small survey conducted by Sindlinger and Company after the first debate. This was the only poll to break out both TV and radio audiences. In the report, Nixon led JFK with radio listeners 49% to 21%. But historians uncovered problems with the survey. To begin with, the size of radio listeners sampled was too small to be representative of people across the entire country. In addition, the survey didn't control for geography, religion, or party preference. For these reasons, the Sindlinger research is viewed by experts as statistically unreliable, suggesting that the perception that JFK won the debate on TV but lost it on radio is a myth. Despite the lack of statistical support, some political heavyweights commented on the difference between hearing and seeing Kennedy at the debate, which may have also perpetuated this myth. After listening to the debate on the radio, JFK's own running mate, Lyndon Johnson, said the boy didn't win. And in his oral history, Barry Goldwater said when he first heard the debate on the radio, he assumed that Nixon had the edge. But after watching it later on TV, Goldwater found Kennedy had done much better than anyone expected.
I said, oh my God. And when I got home that night, my sister was at the house and she said, you know that Kennedy's not so young.
In his oral history, Goldwater talked about the power of Kennedy's first impression.
He looked smart, he looked eager, he looked bright. And this got over, and Nixon never could catch up from it. I think that was the
turning point of the campaign.
That was the campaign, you might say, right there. And Dick could never get it back, and from then on in, Jack had it.
With the combination of Nixon's lack of makeup, fatigue, and the lingering effects of his illness, Lou Harris's analysis suggested that Nixon's appearance had some effect on viewers. Nixon's single biggest negative number, according to Harris, was that he looked ill at ease, scared, or sick. This negative number was 4 times higher than JFK's highest negative, which was that some people thought he was too critical of President Eisenhower. Whether it was style or substance, the first televised debate left viewers with a lasting impression. Coming up, we'll talk with today's political advisors about how live debates have transformed since their incarnation in 1960.
Are you enjoying the 60/20 podcast? This podcast is just one of many initiatives, programs, and resources supported by the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. The JFK Library Foundation is a nonprofit that provides financial support, staffing, and creative resources for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. Learn more about the JFK Library and the Foundation at jfklibrary.org.
When President Kennedy and Richard Nixon debated for the first time, it was a debate between two men who disagreed politically, but treated each other respectfully.
I don't believe in big government, but I believe in effective governmental action. And I think that's the only way that the United States is going to maintain its freedom. It's the only way that we're going to move ahead. I think we can do a better job.
Senator Kennedy has suggested in his speeches that we lack compassion for the poor, for the old, and for others that are unfortunate. Let us understand throughout this campaign that his motives and mine are sincere. I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to see people who are unemployed. I know Senator Kennedy feels as deeply about these problems as I do. But our disagreement is not about the goals for America, but only about the means to reach those goals.
60 years later, the debates have changed. From 2016...
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
To 2020.
This is a left-wing director. This is a left-wing
white supremacist.
This is radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen,
the cordiality of the 1960 debate seems like a distant memory. Here's Adam Frankel, speechwriter for President Barack Obama.
Yeah, this has nothing to do with substance. Very little, frankly, that Donald Trump does has to do with substance. A lot of it is about playing to these sorts of emotional responses to things. And I think that's important. And I think that we should recognize that. And we shouldn't be afraid to play to people's emotional responses.
As we recall from 1960, JFK was particularly interested in the ground rules for the debates. But this cycle, the rules seem to have gone out the window.
The worst part of Obamacare,
sir.
Chris,
You're
that was the
debating
worst
him,
part of
not me.
Obama.
Let me ask my question.
Well, I'll ask Joe. The individual mandate was the most unpopular aspect of Obamacare. I got rid of it.
I'd like
and
you
we
to,
will protect
Mr.
people
President,
with
I'm the moderator of this
conditions.
debate, and I would like you to let me ask my question, and then you can answer.
Go ahead.
Frankel still hopes there's a way to improve the state of our current debates to make them more uplifting than polarizing.
They should play to people's better angels and resistance to things like fear and division and call on people to try and see ourselves in one another. So I think it's not entirely playing to people's emotions is not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to make sure we're speaking to the right emotions and calling out the impulses that will actually bring people together.
Time will tell if the tone of debates will move away from the knockdown, drag-out style that we've seen in recent years towards a debate fitting for the office of the president. In another stark contrast from 1960, the pace of debates today compared to the Kennedy-Nixon debates is vastly different. Obama campaign advisor and political strategist David Axelrod explains.
The idea that anybody would get an 8-minute opening statement, as the Kennedy and Nixon did, is unthinkable. Everything happens faster. Your answers have to be faster. By the way, the questions were longer in that debate than most answers are in presidential debates now.
Amy Dacey helped organize the 2016 primary debates for the Democratic Party. She says because today's debates don't allow for in-depth answers, many candidates have gravitated towards the town hall format. In a town hall, a single candidate can take questions from a live audience for an hour or more.
These town halls that you see a lot of the cable networks use, the long form, some candidates seem to enjoy more, where they can really, in less of a short soundbite, talk at length about how they would handle, some of the hardest and most challenging situations in our world today. It's hard to make a 90-second response to how you would handle that.
In fact, in his 1968 presidential campaign, Richard Nixon avoided the debate stage altogether. Instead, he opted for solo town halls where he could address voters directly. However, unlike today, Nixon's events were staged, where the people in the town hall and their questions were carefully selected by the Nixon campaign.
In 1968, he didn't debate. What he did was he staged what we would call today town halls. He staged town halls with voters and then put those on the air. That's what he did. No, he didn't debate again in 1968 or 1972. No more debates for Richard Nixon.
As it turned out, after 1960, there wouldn't be another presidential debate for 16 years. The tradition would become permanent at that time when Governor Jimmy Carter ran against President Gerald Ford. There is one thing that hasn't changed as presidential debates have evolved, according to David Axelrod, and that's the amount of preparation candidates need to do to win a debate.
You have teams who are working months and months and months to develop a material to make sure that all the research is done on past statements and actions by the opponent. Most campaigns, when you get to this level now, actually we did, and I think the other side did as well, we reconstructed the actual stage as it would look when the candidate got on the stage so that they could feel wholly comfortable with the whole environment.
Axelrod says what most candidates and strategists learned from the Kennedy-Nixon debates was this.
These are essentially oral exams in front of the American people, and you need to be prepared in terms of the language and also prepared in terms of the stagecraft. And the Kennedy-Nixon debate was a forerunner of all of that.
The Kennedy-Nixon debates didn't just influence presidential campaigns to come. They were critical, if not decisive, in driving the final results of the 1960 election. Shortly after the election, a study by pollster Elmo Roper determined that for 5% of all voters, or roughly 3.4 million people, the polls showed the debates were a key factor in their decision. Of that 3.4 million, about 2.5 million went for JFK and 900,000 went for Nixon. That's a 1.5 million difference in an election that was decided by less than 113,000 votes. Numbers aside, Kennedy's message was one that rallied the country to come out and vote.
And I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out for the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again. That's the question before the American people, and only you can decide what you want this country to be, what you want to do with the future. I think we're ready to move, and it is to that great task, if we're successful, that we will address ourselves.
The first debate may have well shifted the momentum in the 1960 campaign, but in the final weeks, there was another set of issues still surrounding the campaign, an existential threat looming over the nation. The candidates would need to address the growing nuclear threat from the Soviet Union as communism slowly crept into Asia, Africa, and even onto America's doorstep in Cuba. We'll address how foreign policy affected the 1960 campaign and how some of the same foreign conflicts back then still echo today. Next time on 6020. Thank you for listening to this episode of 6020. Along with Jamie Richardson and myself, Matt Porter, 6020 is made possible with the help from our co-producer, Rick King. Thank you to our research assistants, Megan McKee and Cassie Mirando. Special thanks to our foundation colleagues, in particular Megan Hull and Executive Director Rachel Floor. Our music is composed by Blue Dot Sessions and artwork by Brian Kang. We also thank all of our guests for lending their voices and expertise to this podcast. And of course, none of this would be possible without the work by archivists and other staff at the JFK Library and Museum, who make much of the material discussed available to all online and to visiting researchers.